Welcome to Crimson Clues, where shadows hide secrets and silence reveals the truth. Every story is a puzzle, and every clue takes you closer to the answer. Subscribe now, join the hunt, and let the mystery begin. Chapter 1, Glow at 9:09. The late August evening had that special quality of light that only occurs in the closing weeks of summer, when the sun hangs lower and the shadows grow longer, as if nature herself was preparing for the change of seasons. Mrs. Price Ridley lingered at the bus stop longer than necessary, fanning herself with the parish newsletter and casting disapproving glances at the overgrown hedge that lined the narrow lane leading toward Much Benham. It was precisely at 9:15 that she first noticed the light. Wrenley House, a Georgian structure of modest but pleasant proportions, has fallen into that peculiar state of genteel decay that is so prevalent in properties whose owners have not returned from faraway countries. The ivy had climbed up to the eaves with the tenacity of nature reclaiming her own, and the window peered stupidly through their dust and neglect. The iron bell next to the front entrance hung at an awkward angle, and its chain broken somewhere within the mechanism. Mrs. Price Ridley had become so used to the house's shuttered emptiness that the sudden appearance of a steady yellow glow in the front upper window brought her to a complete stop. She adjusted her spectacles with the meticulous attention of someone who wants to be assured of what she's seeing before forming an opinion. "Well, I never," she mumbled to the nighttime air, though no one was there to hear her comment. The light was not the flickering, uncertain gleam one might expect from boys holding candles or tramps making do with whatever lighting they could find. This was a proper light, steady and intentional, projecting a warm rectangle of yellow against the dirty glass of the window. Some quarter of a mile down the lane, Tom Briggs was cycling home from his chores in Lady Bantry's garden, his bicycle basket full with late roses that her ladyship had insisted he bring for his wife. Tom was a diligent man who knew every stone and pothole on the road connecting the two settlements, and he too observed the unexpected sight of light where there should be none. He slowed his bicycle and came to a halt, one foot resting on the ground, peering through the fading dusk. The sight was sufficiently remarkable to cause him to remove his cap and scratch his greying head in puzzlement. Now, what would anyone want in that old place? He asked loudly, addressing the roses, who remained fragrantly silent. The Reverend Leonard Clement, returning from a visit to an old parishioner in Much Benham, was the third person to witness the phenomena. The excellent Reverend was a contemplative man, and his thoughts were preoccupied with death and pastoral care of souls when the unexpected light called his attention to the abandoned house. He paused at the wooden gate, which hung slightly skewed on its hinges, noting with the natural concern of a man used to property maintenance that the garden had become somewhat overgrown. But it was the light in the upper window that drew his attention, constant and incongruous in that environment of emptiness and neglect. "Boys, I shouldn't be surprised," he whispered to himself, though something about the quality of that light suggested a more intentional aim than juvenile mischief, or perhaps some unfortunate soul-seeking sanctuary. The Reverend was a compassionate man by nature and profession, so his first thought was to see if anyone needed help. However, the late hour and the certainty that his wife would be expecting him for their nightly coffee slowed his pace. He made a mental point to discuss the situation with Arthur Pike, the caretaker, when they next met. That evening, none of the three witnesses considered continuing their investigation. Mrs. Price Ridley boarded her bus. Tom Briggs returned home to his wife and roses, while the Reverend Clement went to his vicarage and cocoa. The light burned consistently until somewhere after 10:20, when it was extinguished as abruptly and purposefully as it had appeared. Arthur Pike arrived to Wrenley House at 7 a.m., as is typical. Pike was a guy of around 60, who took his responsibilities as caretaker seriously, as one would expect after a lifetime of service to property and propriety. He carried the enormous iron key that allowed him access to the mansion, and his aged hands were covered in calluses and stains from years of maintenance work. As he reached the front door, Pike detected nothing wrong with the house's external appearance. The shutters remained barred as he had left them, and the ivy continued to creep toward the roof tiles. Only when he slipped his key into the lock and pushed open the hefty oak door was the morning's typical routine disrupted by discovery. The entrance hall retained the musty odor of disuse and dampness that distinguishes long vacant buildings. But there was something more in the air, a Swedish disagreeable stench that Pike couldn't define. His boots echoed on the bare floorboards as he made his way toward the staircase, following some instinct that drove him upward. The blue bedroom, named after the faded William Morris wallpaper that still clung to the walls and places, was located at the front of the home. It was here that Pike discovered what would turn a quiet morning into a day that villagers would remember and talk about for years. Roland Moresby lay sprawled on the dusty flooring, his face swelled beyond recognition, and his hands covered in angry red welts from many stings. A hurricane lamp hung on the window stool, its wick burned down to a charcoal stub, providing little light in the gloomy morning air that trickled through the dirty glass. The shutters were barred from within, exactly as Pike had left them. The key to the room was on the inside, and the small ventilator window was tightly wedged with what appeared to be a gentleman's silk scarf, rolled and pushed into the gap. But it was the wasps that caused Pike to step aside, exclaiming involuntarily in disgust and amazement. They were scattered on the flooring and windowsill. A dozen or more striped insects, their bodies motionless and silent in death. Among them, like strange snow, lay a dusting of delicate papery dust that caught the morning light with an almost silvery sheen. When summoned, Dr. Hedok took one look at the scene and delivered his verdict with the brisk authority of a man who has seen death in many forms over his long career. He declared anaphylactic shock, staring over his spectacles at the hapless Mr. Moresby. "Poor demon, you must have disturbed a nest. I fear he's a nasty man to be in such a bad predicament." Inspector Slack arrived with the efficiency that characterized his approach to all official duties, and assessed the situation with the eye of someone used to finding simple reasons for complicated appearances. His attention was instantly attracted to a broken tread on the stairs, which creaked ominously under his heavy weight. He announced plainly and with joy, "Fellow breaks in, slips down the stairs, treads in the dark. Panics, stumbles into the wasp nest, is stung and dies from shock. I think that serves him right." At this point, Miss Jane Marple arrived with her companion, Mrs. Dolly Bantry. The two ladies had encountered Inspector Slack in the village, and with the delicate persistence that distinguishes certain perceptive women, persuaded him to let them see the scene. Miss Marple approached the blue bedroom with the quiet attentiveness of someone who has learned to look closely before reaching conclusions. Her fading blue eyes took in the scene's nuances with the same careful care she would have used to inspect a piece of needlework for dropped stitches or defective designs. It was she who first noticed the strange amber smear on the door's hasplatch, a sticky material that snagged her fingernail when she touched it gingerly. Moving closer to check the inner face of the door, her keen eyes discovered two minute punctures near shoulder height, one of which still contained a little glossy bead of the same amber material. Miss Marple raised the dusty curtain with the care of someone who is used to dealing with delicate objects. A single brown grain clung to the fabric, and she scrutinized it with the care of a naturalist scrutinizing a rare specimen. "Propolis," she said to herself, her voice clear enough for Mrs. Bantry to hear. "Bees create glue to seal their hives." Her gaze shifted to the narrow drift of crumbled grey paper that ran along the skirting board, resembling nothing more than the chewed pulp from which wasps build their nests. Miss Marple slowly straightened, her knitting needles clicking softly in the bag she held. When she spoke, her voice had that unique tone of quiet conviction that many who knew her had come to admire. A shredded thread from this veil matched a tiny puncture mark on the bedroom door, caused by the fabric brushing against the wood at shoulder height. The psychological data was as compelling. Mr. Laura owned the file of alarm scent that had been utilized to boost the wasp's hostility, describing its presence to us as an educational tool for local children. His access to the Women's Institute typewriter came from his volunteer work drafting beehive notices during the secretary's illness. Miss Marple's pale eyes gleamed with joy as she addressed the issue of opportunity. On deeper scrutiny, his loving sister's alibi proved to be false. During our visit, I noticed that the mantelpiece clock in their sitting room was running 6 minutes slowly. When she said they were together at 9:15, the true time was 9:21, allowing enough time for the concluding phases of the murder. The timeline that emerged from this investigation provided a clear image of deliberate murder. Harold had placed the lantern earlier that day, utilizing the preset shutter mechanism to gain entrance to the blue bedroom. The light attracted wasps in the darkened house while also signaling to nearby villagers that something was happening at the appropriate moment. Mr. Laura would have activated the trap as soon as he saw the light arrive, knowing that Mr. Misby had entered the prepared room and shut himself in as instructed in the documents. A short pull on the attic cord, a few minutes for the wasps to finish their deadly work, and a return through the back window to resecure the shutters before walking home to his sister's knitting. Mrs. Bantry shivered at the cold calculations revealed by this recreation. To plot such a thing in such detail, Jane, implies that your mind has progressed beyond natural grieving into something considerably more deadly. Indeed, Harold Lermer's love for his wife had given way to anger for the man he blamed for her murder. The scientific training that was supposed to provide him serenity through understanding instead armed him with the knowledge to plan perfect revenge. The confrontation with Harold Lermer took place that afternoon in his cottage workshop, surrounded by the tools and supplies used to carry out his intricate crime. When confronted with the evidence of the attic cable, the alarm fragrance, and most damningly, the broken beekeeper veil, his composure finally broke. "I only meant to frighten him," he mumbled, his hands trembling as the weight of discovery fell on him, forcing him to beg and plead like she must have done when the onslaught began. The light was supposed to keep everyone looking the wrong way at the window, instead of what was really happening. But Inspector Slack had heard such accusations before, and his attitude was professionally emotionless. "Harold Lermer, I am arresting you for the deliberate murder of Roland Moresby. You are not obligated to say anything, but anything you say may be recorded and used as evidence." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Harold's clinical perfection vanished completely. "She was everything to me," he said softly, tears flowing down his pale cheeks. He killed her as if he had done it himself, and he referred to it as one of those things. I couldn't just let him walk away from what he had done. The cottage, which had previously been a shrine to systematic learning and peaceful devotion, was converted in that instant into the site of a broken man's final surrender to justice. Harold's beekeeping equipment, which had once brought him closer to nature's mysteries, had transformed into implements of premeditated revenge. Later that evening, once the formalities of arrest and first questioning were finished, Miss Marple found herself wandering in the vicarage garden with Mrs. Bantry. The late summer breeze conveyed the perfume of roses and the distant hum of bees going about their ancient business, unaware of the human drama unfolding around them. "A light in an empty house," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her voice expressing the pain that comes with witnessing the ruin that grief can do. How unkindly it beckoned, Jane. "How unkind!" Miss Marple paused on her evening walk, her knitting bag clasped in hands that had witnessed far too much of human nature's propensity for both love and hate. "Yes, my dear, these attention-grabbing items are frequently set such that no one looks where they should." She lifted her face to catch the evening breeze, finding in the natural world a peace that human affairs rarely provided, a little string that controlled a deadly nest, and the habits of a man whose precision with a lantern wick betrayed the methodical mind that planned such terrible vengeance. St. Mary's bells began their evening call to prayer, their bronze voices echoing the ancient message of forgiveness and redemption across the community. But for Harold Lermer, whose love had turned to hatred and his grief into murder, such mercies would not come until justice had been served and the whole cost of his meticulous retribution had been paid. "One doesn't carry a wasp's nest into a room by accident, Inspector," she replied with gentleness. "One moves it there fairly purposefully." Chapter 2, Room with Lamp. Inspector Slack possessed the specific characteristic of thoroughness, which, while lacking imagination, suited him well in the meticulous reconstruction of events. Standing in the blue bedroom with his notes at the ready, he began to piece together what he saw as the clear chronology of the previous evening's catastrophe. He stated as clearly as daylight, with the assurance of a man who wanted to answer his puzzles before they began to mystify. Some vagrant or other breaks into the house, looking for a place to stay the night, and sets up a small camp here, with his lantern for light. He pointed to the hurricane lantern, which still perched on the window stool, its glass chimney stained with soot but otherwise undamaged. The metal reservoir revealed that the paraffin within had burned down to about half its capacity, and the wick had a square-cut edge that indicated meticulous trimming rather than the ragged tear of negligence. "Josie's his scarf there to block the drafts," Slack said, pointing to the silk scarf that had been firmly shoved into the ventilator window. "Fair enough, I suppose. No one wants to sleep in a draft." A cracked glass jar that had previously housed jam or preserves rested on the room's only remaining chair. Slack carefully lifted it and sniffed the rim, noting the faint sweet residue that lingered to the interior. He brought his supper with him, apparently a jam jar for his water or something. He laid the jar down with the attitude of someone cataloguing evidence. All was normal until he disturbed the wasps. Miss Marple, who had been examining this reconstruction with the same care she would have given a particularly delicate pattern in her knitting, was puzzled by a few minor elements that seemed to defy Inspector Slack's clean explanation. The lantern's wick, for example, bothered her much. She had known many persons in her long life who trimmed wicks for oil lamps and lanterns, and everyone seemed to have developed their own unique manner. Some chopped at an angle, believing that it produced a better flame. Others favored a curved cut that mimicked the natural form of the burning surface. But this wick was cut straight across with mathematical accuracy, as precise and intentional as if measured with a ruler. Arthur Pike, when questioned about his personal tendencies in such issues, exhibited his technique with evident pride. "Always cut mine on the slant," he instructed. He produced a well-used pair of wick scissors from his pocket. "It improves your drawing ability, you see. That is something I learned from my father, who learned it from his father before him." The caretaker studied the lamp with the meticulous attention of a guy who understood such equipment thoroughly. "This isn't my work," he said confidently, "and it's not one of my lanterns either. I'd recognize my own kit anywhere. Mrs. Barnes, a sturdy woman who made her living by taking in laundry and had been cleaning Pike's work clothes for the better part of a decade, was similarly convinced about what those clothes did not contain when she last touched them. Never a spot of honey on anything Arthur brings me," she asserted confidently, her arms akimbo, as if her knowledge of stains and their causes was unquestionable. "No paraffin, nothing but what you'd expect from standard lamp work. This jam business is something altogether else." Mrs. Dolly Bantry gave the next piece of information that would be crucial in the ongoing investigation. Her ladyship had the kind of mind that notices and recalls social minutiae with extraordinary accuracy, especially when they involved the comings and goings of individuals in her neighborhood. "I saw Roland Morrisby yesterday afternoon," she reported to the small group assembled in Renly House's entry hall. "He was hovering around the green in the intentional way that people do when they are waiting for someone or something. I must mention that this is rather rare behavior for him. Usually a busy man, often rushing around with his papers and schemes. The revelation of Moresby's presence in the area the day before his murder sparked further investigation, and it wasn't long before the party at the Blue Boar public house revealed more details. The landlord, a man named Griggs, who took pride in knowing the business of everyone who passed his threshold, remembered the incident vividly. "A note came for Mr. Moresby yesterday evening," he affirmed, wiping his hands on his apron as he spoke, handed by some youngster or other. "I can't tell you which boy it was. They all seem the same to me when they're running errands, but I recall the note clearly. Strange that." He paused in the manner of someone who understands the importance of knowledge and wants to disseminate it at the appropriate pace. It was typed, which seemed unusual for village communication. Most individuals here know each other well enough to write by hand, and typing itself was unusual. The capital E kept sliding below the line, as if the typewriter needed to be adjusted. Miss Marple's attention was quickly drawn to this detail. In her experience, mechanical equipment frequently exhibited unique features that might be as distinguishable as fingerprints, and a typewriter with a failed letter was clearly one such instrument. "Do you recall the message's content?" she inquired gently. Griggs nodded in approval. "Renly 9:15. News of your lease signed with just an initial. I couldn't tell which letter it was supposed to be." The information shed a whole different light on Moresby's presence at the abandoned house. Rather than being the victim of an accidental encounter with an undisturbed wasp's nest, he seems to have been summoned to Renly House at the same moment when the unusual light was noticed. Inspector Slack, to his credit, immediately realized the gravity of this development. "So he was drawn there," he said grimly. "Someone wanted him in that house at that specific time." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her fingers instinctively working on the knitting she carried around. "It appears so, Inspector. The question that immediately arises is whether the person who delivered the note anticipated what would happen to Mr. Moresby upon arrival." She paused, her needles clicking softly in the quiet of the inn's public room, or perhaps they had arranged it. The consequences of this prospect weighed heavily on the little group. What looked to be a terrible accident was taking on the darker aspects of something far more nefarious. Dr. Haddock, who had remained mostly silent throughout these discussions, felt compelled to express his professional opinion on the subject. He acknowledged that many wasp stings can be lethal to someone with significant allergic sensitivity. However, while such reactions are not rare, they are unique enough to make one question about the coincidence of Mr. Moresby experiencing such a circumstance precisely when and where he was summoned. Mrs. Bantry shuddered gently. "You mean to say that someone planned for those horrible animals to be waiting for him?" Miss Marple quietly suggested that we look into that note more closely and perhaps inquire about typewriters in the village that may be experiencing mechanical problems. Her pale blue eyes had that distinct glint that people who knew her had come to recognize as the sign of a mind beginning to find patterns beyond the surface of seemingly random events. "After all," she said, her tone as sweet as ever, "whoever authored that memo must have had a thorough understanding of Mr. Moresby's interests, right? The mention of a lease implies that he is well versed in his business concerns, and the timing implies that he knows just when their trap will work best." The word trap hung in the afternoon air of the Blue Balls public area, like an accusation awaiting proof. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices resin. Constable Lake produced the note that summoned Roland Moresby to his death, with some ceremony, after retrieving it from the deceased's coat pocket. It sat now on the polished table in the Blue Boar's private parlour, a modest piece of cream-coloured writing paper with the stark message that Griggs had so accurately remembered. Miss Marple removed her spectacles from her reticule and read the document with the same care she would have given to a particularly difficult crossword puzzle. The typing was erratic, with the capital E sitting noticeably below the line in both cases, but it was not the typewriter's mechanical peculiarity that drew her attention the most. "How interesting," she whispered, adjusting her spectacles to look closer at the paper's surface. "Inspector, might I borrow your magnifying glass for a moment?" Slack reluctantly delivered the necessary device, having grown to appreciate Miss Marple's capacity to find importance in details that had eluded his own notice over the years. Under the magnifying glass, the paper revealed details that the naked eye had missed. There was a faint, greasy trace near the fold of the paper, where nervous fingertips might have touched it while composing or reading. More intriguing was a little flake of amber-coloured substance that adhered to the crease, so small that it might easily have been mistaken for a speck of dust or dirt. Miss Marple gently removed the flake with the tip of her knitting needle and rubbed it between her fingers. The substance responded to pressure with a unique stickiness, and when it warmed to her touch, it emitted a faint but identifiable scent. "Propulolus," she said gently. The similar substance was found on the door latch in the blue bedroom. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward with interest. "You've mentioned it before, Jane. Something about bees, wasn't it?" "Yes, it was, my dear. Bees produce propolis to patch holes in their colonies and strengthen the comb. It has a somewhat distinctive smell, particularly when it has been mixed with turpentine, as beekeepers commonly do to make it more malleable for their task." She paused, allowing her audience to process the ramifications. The interesting part is that we are apparently dealing with wasps rather than bees. However, this commodity appeared on both the letter that led to Mr. Moresby's death and the door through which he proceeded to meet his fate. Inspector Slack's countenance had become more thoughtful as he processed this information. "You imply that the person who wrote this note has regular contact with bees. I am guessing that whoever handled this note has recently been working with propolis." "Yes, and in my experience, Inspector, such work is most usually done by individuals who raise bees for honey production, or those who research the habits of these hard-working insects." Miss Marple delicately folded the note and returned it to Constable Lake, but not before making a final, critical observation. "You might also want to check the latch staple on the blue bedroom door again, Inspector. I bet you will discover a grain or two of fresh yellow pollen there, despite the house's apparent neglect." The return journey to Renly House was spent in thoughtful silence, with each member of the small party preoccupied with their own reflections on the growing complexity of what had appeared to be a simple case of misadventure. The afternoon sun slanted through the blue bedroom's dusty windows, illuminating mows that moved in the calm air like visible thoughts. Miss Marple's prognosis proved correct. When Inspector Slack studied the latch staple with a magnifying glass, he saw many grains of bright yellow pollen embedded in the roughened metal surface. The pollen was fresh enough to keep its color and hadn't been scattered by wind or weather. "Someone with bee hands," Miss Marple said gently, using a country word for persons whose employment required them to be in regular contact with apiaries. "Someone who handles comb frames on a frequent basis, causing pollen and propulolis to stick to their fingertips and spread to everything they touch." Dr. Hedog, who had joined them for the second investigation of the site, nodded in professional agreement. "That's correct, Miss Marple. Anyone who works closely with beehives would undoubtedly have such traces on their person, especially during the active season when the bees gather nectar and produce honey." The doctor hesitated, his brow wrinkled with thought. "However, I must admit that the inconsistency you have detected perplexes me. We have conclusive evidence of beekeeping activity. However, the fatality was caused by wasps. While the two insects are related, they have very different habits and reactions." Miss Marple's needles began their calm clicking as she pondered the ramifications of the evidence they'd collected. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "that's exactly the point. Someone wanted us to observe a wasp attack and nothing else. The betraces were unintentional, left by hands more used to gentler tasks than the terrible business of murder." The words sank into the silence of the blue bedroom like a stone into calm water, spreading waves of comprehension throughout the gathering party. What began as an investigation into an accidental death had evolved into something considerably more serious as minor but telling details accumulated. Inspector Slack cleared his throat with the air of a man accepting an uncomfortable responsibility. "If you're right, Miss Marple, and I'm beginning to believe you are, we need to identify everyone in the village who keeps bees or has cause to touch bee products on a daily basis." "Inspector, this is a wonderful suggestion. I suppose we should also investigate the typewriter that created our enigmatic note. In a village the size of St. Mary's, there can't be many such machines, and even fewer with the mechanical flaw we discovered." Mrs. Bantry, who had been unusually silent throughout these conversations, suddenly piped out with a question that had been bothering her. "But Jane, it's as if someone set up Mr. Moresby's experience with the wasps. How could they be convinced the attack would be fatal? Surely most individuals survive wasp stings, no matter how nasty they are." Dr. Haddock responded, his professional experience casting a harsher shadow on their investigation. "Anaphylactic shock, Mrs. Bantry, is unpredictable in severity, but fatal in its most severe symptoms. Someone who knew Mr. Moresby's medical history could have predicted that he was especially vulnerable to such reactions." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her fingers continuing their steady job with the knitting needles. Perhaps, she reasoned, they merely assured that the number and concentration of stings would be enough to exceed any normal person's ability to survive the attack. After all, if one has control over the circumstances of the contact, one can significantly impact the outcome. The ramifications of this remark crept over the gathering like a shiver, despite the late summer afternoon's warmth. They were no longer dealing with a crime of passion or chance, but rather something far more premeditated and cold-blooded. "We'll need to talk to everyone in the village who keeps bees," Inspector Slack announced with newfound conviction. "We'll have to look very closely at that typewriter." Miss Marple smiled softly, but there was steel beneath the compassion in her beautiful blue eyes. "Indeed, Inspector, because I have a strong suspicion that once we discover our beekeeper, we will have identified our murderer." Chapter 4. The Note to Meet. The investigation into the beekeepers of St. Mary's and its surroundings proved to be a more difficult task than Inspector Slack had imagined. In a countryside where honey production was both a practical requirement and a source of modest revenue for many people, beekeeping was not an uncommon activity. The first person that emerged from their inquiries was Harold Lerma, a quiet guy who kept 3 hives in a corner of the vicarage orchard. The Reverend Clement had been quite obliging in supplying this information, stating that Mr. Laura had approached him several years ago with a desire to construct his apiary in the shaded place behind the apple trees. "A most conscientious gentleman," the Reverend told them as they proceeded across the orchard to the tidy row of white wooden hives. "Quite knowledgeable about bee habits, and extremely attentive to ensure that his charges do not cause any bother to the neighbors. I have never had a single complaint about his activity." Harold Laura appeared to be around 50 years old, with slightly bowed shoulders, from spending a lot of time hunched over intricate work. His hands had the characteristic stains and minor scars that identified him as an expert in bee colony maintenance. When approached by Inspector Slack and his associates, he showed neither surprise or reluctance to reveal his apiary activities. "I started keeping bees about 4 years ago," he continued, his voice carrying the quiet cadences of a guy used to being around books rather than people. "My late wife had always displayed an interest in honey production, and after her passing, I found the task to be both soothing and practical." Miss Marple watched him with the same care she reserved for those whose anguish had left permanent lines on their faces. Harold Lerma has the unique kind of grief associated with persons who have loved passionately and lost that love due to circumstances beyond their control. The second person to catch their interest was Martha Pathick, a wealthy widow who ran a small but profitable honey toll at the monthly Women's Institute market. Mrs. Petherick was an enthusiastic woman whose cottage buzzed with the bustle of preserving, bottling and packaging the different results of her hard work. "I don't keep the bees, you realize," she stated as she guided them through her neatly arranged kitchen. "I get honey and comb from numerous local farmers and prepare it for sale. The work is ideal for me because there is always a demand for high-quality honey and preserves." Her hands, like Harold Lerma's, exhibited signs of frequent touch with bee products, and her knowledge of their qualities and applications was evidently considerable. She spoke authoritatively about the numerous types of honey produced during different seasons, as well as the unique characteristics that separate one locality's product from another. The third individual who emerged from their investigations was possibly the most unexpected. Constance French was the daughter of a caregiver, a young woman of about 25, who had recently and mysteriously became involved with bees. Several people reported seeing her near Renly House, carrying what appeared to be a candle or lantern. However, the purpose of her midnight excursions was unknown. When questioned about these observations, Miss French was apprehensive, which seemed out of proportion to the seriousness of the questions. She claimed to have been checking reports of unusual sounds coming from the abandoned property, stating that her father's role as a caretaker in a neighboring town had made her concerned about the security of uninhabited houses. "I thought someone was using the house without permission," she said, her hands twisting frantically in her lap. "Father always said that unoccupied properties attract all sorts of unpleasant personalities, so I felt compelled to explore." The fourth and final member of their party was, of course, Roland Moresby, whose link to bees was unknown, but whose presence in the village and eventual destiny made him important to their study. Inquiries into his history revealed that he was a representative for a building syndicate with interests in property development across the county. The landlord of the Blue Boar offered the most revealing information about Moresby's recent actions. He'd been looking into various properties in the region, Griggs revealed as he polished glasses behind the bar, with a particular interest in the aotements behind the church and some of the older cottages that could be redeveloped. This information painted Moresby's presence in the village in a different light. Rather than being an unlucky victim of circumstance, he appears to have actively participated in activities that could possibly have made enemies among the local population. Miss Marple was particularly drawn to a detail discovered during their investigation of the numerous typewriters available for public use in the area. The Women's Institute kept an ancient Underwood machine in the hall cupboard to prepare notifications and mail for their numerous activities. When Inspector Slack tested the equipment, the same dropped E that had defined the mysterious letter emerged right away in the sample text. The machine was undoubtedly the source of the message that had led Moresby to his demise. Inspector Martha Petherick, however, objected when the discovery was made public. "We all use the typewriter from time to time. Anyone who serves on a committee or assists with event planning may encounter the need to type notices and announcements. This view was corroborated by several other members of the Women's Institute, who stated that the machine was freely available to anyone who needed its services. The key to the cupboard where it was stored was kept on a hook beside the door, and it could be used without permission or supervision. Miss Marple, on the other hand, had seen something the others had not. Among the different papers and announcements pinned to the hallboard was a sheet promoting the previous month's honey display, and the dropped E that distinguished their strange note appeared several times in the text. When asked about this specific document, Martha Petrick reddened slightly and confirmed that she had typed the notice. "I was functioning as the event's secretary," she explained, "and someone needed to write the notice for posting." But Miss Marple's focus had already shifted from this evident connection to something far more subtle and potentially significant. "I wonder," she continued gently, "if we may ask who else has recently used the typewriter for official business. The Honey Show announcement indicates that whoever prepared it was familiar with the machine's specific qualities. The answer to this question would be most illuminating. According to the current secretary, Harold Lermer volunteered to prepare many notices for a series of beekeeping lectures when she was ill with influenza the previous winter. She remembered how helpful the gentleman was. He seemed to be highly familiar with typewriters and created the most professional-looking announcements. I was quite appreciative for his aid during my illness." Inspector Slack took careful note of this information, recognizing its possible relevance in the unfolding web of links surrounding the mystery death at Renly House. "So we have proven," he concluded grimly, "that some of our suspects have both the means to manufacture the note that lured Moresby to his death and knowledge of bee goods, which appears to have been mistakenly passed to the message." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles working to their usual cadence. "Indeed, Inspector, the question that now arises is who of these persons had both the motivation and the opportunity to set up such an elaborate and fatal trap." Chapter 5. Paper. Dust on the sill. Miss Marple returned to Renly House. The morning after their interviews with the Ville's beekeepers, armed with a collection of little items that would have perplexed a casual observer, but which she saw as necessary tools for the appropriate investigation of evidence. Among these items was a clean postcard, several small envelopes, and a magnifying glass of substantially superior quality than Inspector Slack's standard issue equipment. The blue bedroom looked different in the early morning light, perhaps less sinister than it had appeared on their prior trips, but no less enigmatic. The pale paper dust that had first piqued Miss Marple's interest remained spread about the windowsill and floorboards, and she now focused her attention on this intriguing material. Miss Marple used the edge of her postcard with the exquisite precision of an archaeologist excavating ancient relics to carefully gather a sample of the papery substance onto the clean surface. Under her magnifying glass, the material showed traits that were not visible to the normal eye. "Most intriguing," she mumbled to herself, though Mrs. Bantry, who had accompanied her on this journey, could detect a calm contentment in her friend's voice. "Dolly, my dear, would you please look at this through the glass and tell me what you see?" Mrs. Bantry received the magnifying glass with some apprehension, knowing from previous experience that Miss Marple's discoveries were frequently both substantial and upsetting. What she saw under magnification made her take a short gasp of surprise. The paper dust was not the usual waste found in abandoned and decayed buildings. Instead, it displayed a definite hexagonal pattern, a regular geometric structure that could only have been generated through a deliberate method. More intriguing was the existence of tiny silvery particles mixed in with the grey papery material, which caught and reflected the morning light with an almost metallic glitter. Mrs. Bantry noted that it resembled the inside of a honeycomb. However, instead of the expected golden color, beeswax is grey, Miss Marple agreed, carefully placing her sample in one of the little envelopes she had brought for the occasion. "But this is not the work of bees, my love. This is the paper comb that wasps make for their nests, formed from chewed wood pulp mixed with their saliva. The hexagonal layout is typical of both bee and wasp construction, but the substance itself reveals which insect was involved." She proceeded carefully around the room, her keen eyes looking for any indications of evidence that had gone unnoticed during their earlier searches. When she switched her focus to the fireplace, her patients were rewarded with another important discovery. A fresh mark in the collected soot could be seen behind the fallen damper register, which had evidently been moved from its original place. The mark was straight and narrow, as if a string or rope had been pulled over the surface with great force. More telling was a short strand of green twine that had snagged on the rough edge of the register opening, a piece of material that was far too fresh and clean to have been there for an extended period of time. Miss Marple called gently, yet her voice could be heard clearly in the calm morning air. "I think you should watch this." Inspector Slack, who had been inspecting the room's outside features on his own, joined them near the fireplace with the ease of a man who had learnt to pay attention when Miss Marple made such statements. Anyone ready to read the evidence's quiet testimony heard a powerful message. Something was suspended in the chimney space, substantial enough to leave visible imprints in the soot when moved or removed. The green twine suggested a link between the fireplace and what had happened in the room above. Miss Marple's next finding, however, proved to be the most revealing of all. A single wasp's body lay in the cold ashes of the fireplace, partially buried beneath years' worth of debris. Unlike its companions dispersed about the room, this insect displayed evident signs of being handled, rather than simply killed by whatever toxic chemical had claimed the others. One wing was shredded in a way that suggested deliberate harm rather than random devastation from natural death, and the body itself had microscopic scratches that could only have been caused by human fingers. Most notably, traces of the same papery nest material clung to the wasp's legs and body, as if it had been purposefully placed among the fragments of its demolished habitat. Someone, Miss Marple noted quietly, was quite concerned that we might uncover evidence of wasp activity in this room. They were less diligent in concealing how the evidence came to be here. Dr. the Haddock, who had come in time to witness the latest discovery, nodded in professional agreement with her assessment. "The damage to this specimen is quite clearly post-mortem," he confirmed after inspecting the deceased wasp using Miss Marple's magnifying glass. "Whatever killed the other insects in this room, this wasp perished by a completely different method." The ramifications became abundantly evident to everyone present. Rather than being the unlucky victim of an unintentional meeting with an aggressive nest, Roland Moresby had been enticed to a chamber that had been set up as a trap. His presence had made no difference to the wasps. They'd been waiting for him. Inspector Slack returned to his notebook and began compiling a list of the evidence they had acquired. "So we have nest material that was purposefully transported into this chamber, cord marks in the chimney indicating a mechanical arrangement, and clear proof that at least part of the wasps were planted, rather than organically there. And," Miss Marple remarked gently, "we have the curious fact that whoever planned this elaborate deception left traces of bee products on both the lure that brought Mr. Moresby here and the very door through which he entered his death chamber." Mrs. Bantry trembled as the gravity of the situation became clear to her. "You mean someone planned all of this?" "They planned for those horrible beasts to be waiting for him." "I'm afraid that's exactly what occurred, sweetheart. Someone with extensive knowledge of bee and wasp behavior, familiarity with wasp habits and vulnerabilities, and access to both the materials required to build this trap and the methods to entice Mr. Moresby into it." The morning sun, which had appeared so nice when they first entered the abandoned house, now seemed to create shadows of a more sinister nature. The blue bedroom, with its fading wallpaper and dusty floorboards, had evolved into something far more terrifying than simple neglect and decay. "The question we must now answer," added Miss Marple, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm, "is which of our suspects possessed not only the necessary knowledge and materials, but also a motive sufficient to drive them to such elaborate and calculated revenge." Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap that resonated throughout the hushed room. "Then we'd better return to the village and begin asking some more pointed inquiries concerning Mr. Moresby's recent business activity. Someone wanted him dead so badly that they spent a lot of time and effort planning for it." As they prepared to depart Renly House, Miss Marple took one last look around the blue bedroom. Her pale eyes took in the scattered evidence of brutal death and deliberate deception, and her countenance retained the distinct quality of determination that people who knew her had come to know as the forerunner to justice. "Indeed, Inspector," her voice was calm, "and I have a strong suspicion that when we discover the motive, we shall find that it lies buried in the past rather than arising from present circumstances. Chapter 6. The Shutter Screw. The external examination of Renly House proved to be as revealing as their investigation of the Blue Bedroom's interior had been. Arthur Pike, summoned once again to assist with their inquiries, approached the shuttered windows with a confident air of a man intimately familiar with every aspect of the property's construction and maintenance. "These shutters have been my responsibility for near on 15 years, he declared, running his weathered hands along the heavy wooden panels that covered the front upper window. "I know every hinge, every catch, and every peculiarity of their operation." The shutters themselves were substantial affairs, constructed of seasoned oak and fitted with iron hinges that, despite their age, showed evidence of careful maintenance. A heavy iron bar dropped across metal brackets to secure them from the interior, a system that Pike demonstrated with obvious pride in his workmanship. "See here," he explained, lifting the bar to show how it settled into its brackets with satisfying precision. "When this bar is in place, there's no opening these shutters from the outside, not without making noise enough to wake the dead." It was Miss Marple who first noticed the anomaly that would prove significant to their investigation. Her attention was drawn to the upper hinge of the left shutter, where the metal showed signs of recent disturbance, despite the overall weathered appearance of the ironwork. "Mr. Pike," she inquired gently, "when did you last adjust or maintain these particular hinges?" Pike examined the hinge with the careful attention of a craftsman reviewing his work. "Not for months, Miss Marple. These hinges run smooth as you please. Have done for years without need of adjustment." Yet beneath the hinge screw was a thin, bruised circle in the paint, a mark that spoke eloquently of metal that had been tightened and then loosened again quite recently. The mark was fresh enough that the underlying wood still showed pale against the weathered paint surface. Miss Marple produced her magnifying glass once more and subjected the hinge to careful scrutiny. "Inspector," she called softly, "I believe you should examine this marking. It appears that someone has been making adjustments to these shutters rather more recently than Mr. Pike's maintenance schedule would suggest." The evidence was unmistakable under magnification. The screw had been turned, and turned recently enough that tiny flakes of paint still clung to the threads. More significant still, the metal washer beneath the screw head showed the bright scratches that indicated recent tool marks. But it was the discovery on the exterior windowsill that provided the most intriguing clue of all, hidden beneath the trailing ivy that had grown thick against the house's facade. Miss Marple's exploring fingers encountered something that made her pause in concentration. "Dolly, my dear," she said quietly, "would you be so kind as to hold back this ivy while I examine what lies beneath?" Mrs. Bantry obliged, though not without some trepidation, having developed a healthy respect for the sorts of evidence that her friend was liable to uncover in the most unlikely places. What Miss Marple revealed when the concealing vegetation was drawn aside was a sight that initially appeared insignificant, but which she clearly regarded as highly meaningful. Someone had recently cut through one of the ivy ties, the tough fiber stems that the plant used to anchor itself to the stonework. The cut was clean and deliberate, made with a sharp blade rather than broken by weather or accident. More telling still, the severed ends were fresh enough to show the pale green of recently cut plant tissue. Why, Mrs. Bantry wondered aloud, would anyone wish to cut through ivy ties? Surely the plant does no harm clinging to the wall unless, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully, one wished the ivy to be movable, rather than firmly anchored if, for instance, one needed to gain access to the window or its fittings without leaving obvious traces of disturbance. Beneath the cut ivy on the stone sill itself, she made yet another discovery that added to the growing collection of evidence. A small smear of what appeared to be soft wax had been rubbed into a groove in the stonework, a substance that had clearly been applied deliberately rather than deposited by accident. Inspector Slack, observing Miss Marple's methodical examination of these seemingly trivial details, found himself impressed despite his natural skepticism. "You're suggesting that someone prepared these shutters in advance, making it possible to operate them from outside, despite their internal locking mechanism?" "I am suggesting precisely that, Inspector. See how the wax has been applied to the groove where the shutter bar would slide when moved from its brackets. Such preparation would allow the bar to be manipulated silently, without the scraping and grinding that would normally accompany its movement." Dr. Whodunit, who'd been observing these discoveries with the fascination of one witnessing expert detection at work, ventured a professional opinion. The level of preparation you're describing suggests someone with considerable knowledge of the house's construction and security arrangements. Indeed it does, Doctor. Someone who had studied the problem carefully and taken the time to make the necessary preparations well in advance of putting their plan into operation. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her examination of the external evidence complete. In her mind, the picture of what had occurred on that fatal evening was beginning to take clearer shape, though significant questions remained to be answered. "Consider, if you will, the sequence of events as they begin to emerge," she said, addressing her small audience with the manner of one organizing her thoughts aloud. Someone who knew the house intimately made careful preparations to these shutters, allowing them to be operated from outside, despite their internal security bar. She paused to allow this information to settle in her listeners' minds before continuing. The same person cut the ivy ties to provide access to the window area without leaving obvious signs of disturbance. They applied wax to ensure that the security bar could be moved silently. Inspector Slack nodded grimly as the implications became clear. So the murderer could enter and leave the room while maintaining the appearance that it had been secured from the inside. Precisely, Inspector. The locked room that so puzzled us initially was nothing more than an elaborate illusion created by someone with both the knowledge and the patience to prepare their deception thoroughly. Arthur Pike, who had been listening to this reconstruction with growing amazement, shook his head in bewilderment. But who could know the house well enough to plan such a thing? And why go to such elaborate lengths when there must be simpler ways to harm a man? Miss Marple's pale eyes held that particular gleam that those who knew her had learned to associate with the approach of revelation. Those, Mr. Pike, are the questions that will lead us to our murderer. Someone who knew this house intimately, someone who understood its security arrangements, and someone who possessed both the technical knowledge and the patience to prepare such an elaborate deception. She began to walk slowly back toward the front of the house, her mind clearly working through the implications of their discoveries. But perhaps most significantly, someone who wished Mr. Morby's death to appear accidental rather than deliberately planned. The question we must now ask ourselves is why such elaborate concealment was necessary. The afternoon sun was beginning to decline as their examination of Renly House drew to a close, casting long shadows across the overgrown garden and giving the abandoned property an even more melancholy. But Miss Marple's expression showed none of the sadness that the setting might have inspired in a more sentimental observer. Instead, her features bore the quiet satisfaction of one who had successfully unraveled a particularly challenging puzzle, and now needed only to identify the hand that had woven its complex deceptions. Chapter 7. Lantern, Wick and Honey. The Women's Institute. Hall in St. Mary exuded the sense of purposeful activity that distinguishes buildings dedicated to the improvement of rural life. On this particular afternoon, the Hall's back room, known locally as the storage area, was alive with the quiet efficiency of several ladies preparing supplies for the upcoming harvest festival. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack discovered Martha Petrick in her element, surrounded by meticulously labeled jars of preserves, bundles of dried herbs, and the various tools of her craft. She worked with the practiced movements of someone who had spent years perfecting the domestic arts, her capable hands moving quickly as she prepared her contributions for the evening's bizarro events. Mrs. Pathick. Inspector Slack began with the formal courtesy he reserved for witnesses whose cooperation he required. "We wondered if we might ask you a few questions about lantern maintenance." Martha looked up from her work with the mild surprise of one who has been asked about an unexpectedly technical subject. "Lanterns, Inspector. Well, I suppose I know as much as any housewife about keeping them in proper working order." She moved to a shelf where several hurricane lanterns stood in niais, the glass chimneys gleaming with the attention of someone who took pride in well-maintained equipment. Selecting one from the group, she demonstrated her technique for trimming the wick with movements that spoke of long practice. "The secret," she explained, wielding her small scissors with evident skill, "is to cut at just the right angle. Too steep and you get an uneven flame, too shallow and the wick won't draw properly." The wick she produced bore the neat slanted cut that she described, a beveled edge that caught the afternoon light filtering through the hall's tall windows. It was a technique that clearly differed from the square-cut wick they had observed in the lantern found beside Roland Moresby's body. My late husband taught me that particular method, Martha continued, her voice carrying the gentle melancholy that often accompanied such references to departed spouses. He was most particular about such things, always said that proper maintenance was the foundation of reliable service. Miss Marple observed these demonstrations with a careful attention she brought to all technical explanations, her mind cataloguing the details that might prove relevant to their investigation. When Martha had completed her illustration of proper wick trimming, Miss Marple ventured a question that seemed to spring from genuine curiosity rather than official inquiry. "I wonder, Mrs. Prick, if you might enlighten us about the keeping of wasps rather than bees. Do you ever have occasion to deal with such creatures in your work with honey and preserves?" Martha's response was immediate and emphatic. "Heavens no, Miss Marple. We keep bees, not pests. Wasps are nothing but trouble for anyone involved in honey production. They rob the hives, disrupt the bees' work, and generally make nuisances of themselves." She paused in her work to give Miss Marple her full attention. "Why, any proper beekeeper spends half the season trying to discourage wasps from interfering with their colonies. The very last thing one would want is to encourage such creatures." From Martha Pathick's cottage. Their investigations led them to the more modest dwelling that served as home to Harold Laura. The contrast between the two establishments was immediately apparent, though both showed evidence of their owner's dedication to the craft of beekeeping. Where Martha's domain was characterized by domestic efficiency and commercial preparation, Harold's workshop spoke of scientific inquiry and methodical study. His small shed behind the cottage contained the standard equipment of the serious apiarist: smokers for calming the bees, protective veils and gloves, and various tools for hive maintenance. But it was the presence of less common items that caught Miss Marple's particular attention. A roll of green binder twine sat on the workbench, identical in appearance to the strand they had found in the chimney at Renly House. More intriguing still was a small teak-head file bearing a handwritten label in Harold's careful script. "Esso," Miss Marple read aloud, holding the tiny bottle up to the light. "Mr. Laura, might I inquire as to the purpose of this particular substance?" Harold's reaction was immediate and telling. A flush spread across his pale features, and his hands, which had been steady while demonstrating his beekeeping equipment, began to tremble slightly. It's rather embarrassing, actually," he stammered, his voice losing the quiet confidence it had held during their previous conversations. "A chemist friend gave me a small quantity of the alarm scent that bees produce when they feel threatened. I thought it might be educational to demonstrate its effects to some of the local boys who had expressed interest in beekeeping." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with the subject. "Rather silly of me, I suppose. The substance is quite potent, and I've never actually used it. The whole idea seemed rather theatrical once I had it in hand." Inspector Slack made a careful note of this admission, recognizing the potential significance of a substance that could artificially provoke aggressive behavior in stinging insects. Miss Marple's examination of Harold's lantern revealed another detail that would prove significant. Unlike Martha's careful angular cuts, Harold trimmed his wicks in precise straight lines, creating the square-topped appearance they had observed in the fatal lantern at Renly House. "I find it gives a more even flame," he explained when questioned about his technique. "Perhaps it's my scientific training, but I prefer the precision of a straight cut to the more artistic approaches others favor." When asked about his whereabouts on the evening of Morby's death, Harold provided what appeared to be a straightforward alibi. "I was at home reading the latest issue of the British Bee Journal," he said. "My sister can confirm this. She was in the sitting room with her knitting, while I studied an article about seasonal honey production." The sister in question, a spinster of perhaps 60 years, whose demeanor suggested a lifetime of quiet devotion to her younger brother's welfare, readily confirmed his account of the evening's activities. "Harold is most regular in his habits," she assured them, with the quiet pride of one who considers reliability to be among the highest virtues. "He always spends his evenings with his journals and books. I was knitting a jumper for the church bazaar, and we both retired at our usual time of 10. As they prepared to leave Harold's cottage, Miss Marple paused to examine the mantelpiece clock that had marked the evening's routine. It was an elderly timepiece of the Sierra that graces many rural homes, its steady tick marking the passage of domestic hours with mechanical reliability. "A handsome clock," she observed, with the polite interest that good manners required. "I do hope it keeps accurate time." Harold's sister smiled with evident pleasure at the compliment. "It runs perhaps 6 minutes slow," she admitted. "Harold is always meaning to have it adjusted, but we've grown so accustomed to its little peculiarity that we hardly notice anymore." Miss Marple filed this information away with the same care she applied to all details that might prove relevant, though its significance would not become clear until later developments in their investigation. As they walked back toward the village center, Inspector Slack reviewed the evidence they had gathered with the systematic approach that characterized his investigative method. "So we have Martha Pickwick, who trims wicks at an angle and claims no knowledge of wasp management," he summarized, "and Harold Lorimer, who cuts his wick square, possesses alarm scent, and has an alibi provided by his devoted sister." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles beginning their familiar rhythm as she organized her thoughts. "Indeed, Inspector, but I find myself particularly interested in the clock that runs 6 minutes slow, and in Mr. Lorimer's explanation for possessing a substance specifically designed to provoke aggressive behavior in stinging insects." Chapter 8, The Cord in the Attic. Inspector Slack found the Ahayas thought of going to Renly House's attic unappealing, as his substantial girth was ill-suited to navigating the tiny staircases and confined interiors that define the highest reaches of Georgian architecture. Nevertheless, Miss Marple's mild but firm recommendation that they explore the area right above the blue bedroom had the weight of need behind it. Arthur Pike, recruited once more to give access and local expertise, handled the mission with the philosophical resignation of someone whose responsibilities had long since stopped surprising him. He fashioned a robust wooden ladder from his collection of maintenance tools and positioned it with the care of someone who recognized the value of appropriate planning. "Watch how you go, Inspector," he warned as Slack began his hesitant ascent. "These antique floors were not designed for modern sizes. If you get my meaning, the attic space that welcomed their exploration was typical for its time and purpose, low ceiling, dusty, and littered with the remnants of decades of human occupancy. Cobwebs hung from the rafters like abandoned drapes, and the air carried the musty fragrance of wood and desertion that distinguishes long unused areas." Inspector Slack was not instantly drawn to the dust or the cobwebs, however. The fragments of what had evidently been a large wasp nest were suspended from one of the central rafters, exactly at the location that corresponded to the blue bedroom below. The nest itself was a work of insect engineering, made from the grey papery pulp produced by wasps digesting wood fiber and combining it with saliva. Its hexagonal chambers demonstrated the geometric precision that nature accomplishes instinctively, yet much of the structure was plainly destroyed by recent disturbance. More important than the nest itself was the method by which it was suspended. A length of cord tied with what any countryman would recognize as a beekeeper's half-hitch descended through a carefully dug hole in the floor and into the room below. Miss Marple, who had navigated the ladder with amazing quickness for a woman her age, scrutinized the arrangement with the same careful attention she gave to all mechanical riddles. The hole through which the cord passed showed signs of recent use, despite being plugged now with what appeared to be fresh putty. "Most ingenious," she muttered, tracing the cord with her finger. Pulling from below would aggressively shake the nest, disturbing its residents to the fullest extent possible. Release the tension, and the nest returns to its suspended position as if nothing had occurred. Aside from the broken nest, there was more evidence that spoke eloquently of human planning rather than natural circumstances. An empty matchbox sticky with jam or preserve residue was proposed as bait to attract and focus the wasp's attention. A folded square of muslin laden with the lingering aroma of honey supplied additional evidence of careful preparation. Inspector Slack, his notebook held precariously on one knee as he stooped in the cramped room, reported these finds with increasing grimness. So the wasps were already irritated when Moresby walked into the chamber below and someone yanked this cord to make them even more hostile. That appears to be the mechanism, Inspector. The alarm aroma we outlined previously would serve to heighten their aggressive response, while the jam and honeyed cloth would provide enticing targets to focus their attention. The cord itself required special notice, as it was made of the same green binder twine that they had seen in Harold Lermer's studio. More telling was the knot that held it to the nest. a half-hitch that required specific knowledge to tie correctly and was widely employed by beekeepers. Dr. Whodunit, who had remained below due to the ladder's limited capacity, raised an issue that represented his professional interest in the mechanical components of the murder. How would the user know when to activate this device? They could hardly see Mr. Moresby's arrival from their perch in the attic. Miss Marple's remark indicated how thoroughly she had investigated all aspects of the case. The light doctor. The lantern that caught the attention of our three witnesses served a dual purpose. It not only supplied an alibi for the actual time of the murder, but it also acted as a warning that the trap was about to be sprung. The ramifications of this discovery cast the entire chain of events in a new dark perspective. The steady glow that had appeared so mysterious to Mrs. Price Ridley, Tom Briggs, and the Reverend Clement was nothing more than a beacon indicating that Roland Moresby had taken the bait and positioned himself for destruction. Arthur Pike, who had been watching this reconstruction with increasing fascination, posed a practical question. But how could the murderer be sure that pulling the cord would produce the desired result? Wasps may be agitated, but that does not ensure a deadly attack. It was Miss Marple who offered the answer that completed their knowledge of the complicated machinery. The cramped quarters, Mr. Pike, and the artificial concentration of aggressive insects in a place where escape had been purposely made difficult. The ventilator was sealed with a scarf. The door was locked from the outside, and there were enough wasps to overwhelm any normal person's ability to defend themselves. She paused, her knitting needles clicking softly, contemplating the cold calculation that such preparation entailed. Someone meticulously examined Mr. Moresby's vulnerabilities and created a trap to exploit them. The finding of more evidence in the attic space provided a more thorough picture of the events leading up to the murder. Traces of the same propolis they had found on the door lock clung to the rope where it had been handled, and tiny bits of beeswax marked the locations where someone had struggled to assure smooth operation of their lethal mechanism. Most damning of all was the existence of what seemed to be a wrapped beekeeping veil put far back under the eaves, where a casual glance would have missed it totally. The mesh fabric revealed the typical discoloration associated with repeated use around active hives, and several strands of the material matched the tiny punctures they discovered on the blue bedroom door. Inspector Slack emerged from the attic, grimly satisfied that his case had been significantly strengthened by physical evidence. So our murderer not only devised this sophisticated trap, but they also took precautions to shield themselves from their own weapon. Indeed, Inspector, and the veil, like the cord and knotting process, points to someone with great experience dealing with stinging insects. Miss Marple took one last glance around Renly House's attic as they prepared to leave. Her pale eyes catalogued the information they had acquired, and her countenance conveyed the serene satisfaction of someone who had successfully rebuilt a complicated jigsaw. "We now understand the means," she explained gently. "A wasp nest set up to be activated by remote control, alarm fragrance to increase aggression, and bait to direct the attack toward the target." The room was sealed from the outside to prevent escape, and the murderer wore protective clothing to ensure his protection. She began her cautious journey down the ladder, her motions purposeful and sure despite her age. What needs to be determined is which of our suspects possessed not only the knowledge and resources required for such a complex operation, but also the motivation that drove them to exact such deliberate revenge. Inspector Slack followed her down with far less grace, his hefty boots ringing against the wooden rungs. "Then we'd better return to the village and begin asking some more direct questions concerning Mr. Moresby's business activities. Someone despised him enough to spend weeks plotting this trap." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully as they emerged into the afternoon sun. The stark contrast between the dusty, tight place they had just left and the open air of the garden was startling, but it only served to highlight the planned nature of Roland Morris's trap. "I believe, Inspector," she added gently, "that the animosity we seek is rooted not in recent business practices, but in some prior tragedy for which Mr. Moresby took responsibility. The meticulous nature of this vengeance suggests that wounds have had time to fester and turn into something genuinely deadly." Chapter 9. A Nest That Has Migrated. The dusk light that crept through the windows of the Clement sitting room cast long shadows across the comfortable furnishings as Miss Marple organized the final parts of her research. Inspector Slack sat with his notebook open, ready to recollect the inevitable conclusions resulting from her rigorous detective work. Mrs. Bantry took her usual seat by the fireplace, while Dr. Haddock and Arthur Pike rounded out the small crowd that had gathered to hear Miss Marple's reconstruction of the crime. The death of Roland Moresby, Miss Marple, began with the quiet authority that characterized her most serious statements, and was neither an accident nor a crime of passion. It was instead the climax of a complex strategy devised in sadness and carried out with the precision of scientific procedure. Her knitting lay in her lap, the needle motionless for once as she marshaled her thoughts with the care that the gravity of the situation needed. Let us start with the light that perplexed our witnesses around 9:15 that evening. Mrs. Price Ridley, Tom Briggs, and our excellent Reverend Clement all noticed the same thing, a continuous illumination in the front upper window of Renly House. She stopped, enabling her listeners to recall their own understanding of that vital element. The light was not, as we first assumed, proof of Mr. Morby's presence in the house. Rather, it was a premeditated signal intended to establish a precise timetable and ensure that witnesses could pinpoint the exact moment when the trap was sprung. Inspector Slack shifted in his chair, his professional mind following the logical flow of her argument. "Do you imply the murderer lit the lantern before Moresby arrived?" "Exactly, Inspector. The lantern was placed and lit as part of the preparation, serving two purposes: attracting wasps in a darkened house, as wasps, like many insects, are drawn to light sources, and providing visible proof to the murderer that their victim had entered the death chamber." Miss Marple's pale eyes moved to cover her entire audience as she resumed her painstaking reconstruction. The note summoning Mr. Moresby was skillfully structured to secure his compliance with the murderer's demands. "Renly 9:15, the status of your lease. Brief enough to avoid suspicion, while compelling enough to ensure his attendance." Dr. Haddock leaned forward with professional attention. But how could the murderer be convinced that Moresby would follow the implicit order to lock himself in the room? The memo, Doctor, had further directions that we had not previously addressed. Our inquiry indicated that Mr. Moresby was instructed to guarantee that no one could see, which explains his cautious latching of the shutters from inside. The scarf offered to seal the ventilator was portrayed as protection against drafts that could disrupt any documents or evidence he planned to examine. Miss Marple's painstaking examination revealed a picture of subtle and extensive manipulation in which the victim had virtually participated in the preparation of his own execution. Every action Moresby had taken since entering the blue bedroom had increased the likelihood of his death and made escape impossible. She went on to say that the mechanical system we uncovered in the attic was key to the murderer's plot. A paper wasp nest was purposefully moved from its natural location and suspended by string over the intended victim. When the cord was pulled from below, the nest was violently shaken, releasing alarm scent and causing the wasps to become extremely aggressive. Arthur Pike, whose first-hand experience with such monsters had made him well aware of their hazards, trembled visibly at the account. "A man is stuck inside a locked room with aggressive wasps. It'd be a horrible way to die." "Mr. Pike, you are correct. However, the murderer went above and above to guarantee the attack was fatal. The jam-smeared matchbox and honeyed muslin were strategically placed to draw the wasp's attention, specifically to the victim's face and hands, the places where stings would be most damaging, and defensive motions would most likely result in more attacks." Miss Marple's voice became more serious as she discussed the most terrible aspect of the crime. The introduction of an artificial alarm fragrance, acetate, turned what may have been a painful but manageable encounter into a coordinated assault by creatures driven to extraordinary levels of hostility. Inspector Slack was amazed by the murder weapon's technical accuracy, despite the fact that his past experience with violent crime did not include such complex approach. "So the wasps were essentially made into guided missiles. In an apt comparison, Inspector, the murderer understood both the biology of wasp activity and their chosen victim's individual weaknesses. The cramped space made escape impossible. The artificial sense provided maximum aggression, and the arrangement of attractants targeted the attack with lethal accuracy." Miss Marple raised her knitting needles and began the soothing rhythm that helped her arrange her thoughts throughout lengthy discussions. The locked room part of the crime was accomplished by carefully preparing the shutters, which allowed them to be secured from the outside while giving the appearance of interior locks. The waxed grooves assured silent operation, while the cut ivy ties allowed for discreet access. Mrs. Bantry, who had been watching this reconstruction with increasing horror, finally asked the question that had been bothering her the most. "But Jane, such meticulous planning implies not only wrath but a frigid hatred that is almost inhumane. What could motivate someone to such deliberate cruelty?" "That, my dear Dolly, takes us to the crux of the matter. The motivation that turned a lovely man into a calculated killer." Miss Marple's voice conveyed the grief that comes with comprehending human nature in all its complexities. Harold Lorimer's loving wife died 3 summers ago as a result of anaphylactic shock from a wasp sting at a market stall. The revelation shed new light on everything they'd learned, converting Harold Lorer from a suspect to a tragic character whose anguish had grown into something lethal. "The circumstances of her death," Miss Marple said slowly, "were exceptionally tragic. The Lorimers had been pushed from their cottage by Moresby's building syndicate at the height of the summer season. Her emergency medical bag was stowed up with her household items, making it unavailable when she needed it the most. Dr. Haddock's professional understanding provided the medical facts that completed the tragedy. Anaphylactic shock can be lethal in minutes if epinephrine is not administered immediately. The delay created by the shift could have meant the difference between life and death." Mr. Moses's reaction to the tragedy, Miss Marple observed with quiet bitterness, was to dismiss it as one of those things, an attitude Harold Lermer found unforgivable. Mosesby believed he had murdered his wife with as much certainty as if he had administered poison himself. The sitting room became silent as everyone present realized the full extent of the catastrophe. Here was motive enough to drive a man to elaborate revenge, particularly a guy whose scientific background had given him both the knowledge and the patience to plan the perfect crime. Miss Marple determined that Harold had chosen wasps as his weapon, not only because they were the cause of his wife's death, but because he wanted Mosby to feel the same horror and helplessness that she had. He envisioned justice as poetic and accurate. Inspector Slack closed his notepad with the finality of a man whose task was plain, no matter how unwilling he was to fulfill it. The evidence was overwhelming, the motivation persuasive, and the methodology thoroughly described. "We'll need to arrest him," he replied grimly, "though I admit I sympathize with his intentions, if not his means." Chapter 10, Even Song, Hand with the Veil. The formal presentation of evidence to Inspector Slack took place the next morning in the Clement sitting room, where the full scope of Miss Marple's research could be put out with the accuracy that such serious problems required. The cumulative evidence of Harold Lermer's culpability formed a pattern so comprehensive that even the most suspicious observer would find it difficult to refute. "Let us consider the methods first," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the quiet authority of one who had solved the issue through careful observation rather than dramatic intuition. "We discovered a paper wasp nest in the attic, hung by a cord that led through a purposefully bored hole into the blue bedroom below. The string was connected with a beekeeper's half-hitch, a knot that requires special skills to tie correctly." She paused to verify that Inspector Slack had documented this critical detail before continuing with her meticulous presentation. "The nest could be disturbed by tugging the cord from underneath, emitting alarm fragrance, and inciting the wasps to attack whatever targets had been prepared with honeyed muslin and jam to attract their attention. The mechanical perfection of the murder weapon was matched by the intricacy of the methods employed to create the locked room illusion. The shutters had already been prepped with waxed grooves to allow the security bar to operate silently from the outside. The ivy ties were severed to offer disguised access, and the overall layout allowed the murderer to seal the room from the outside while giving the impression of internal locks. Dr. Haddock, who had been considering the medical elements of the case, provided his professional opinion on the murder method. The combination of restricted environment, numerous hostile insects, and manufactured alarm fragrance would result in situations in which few people could live. The murderer effectively ensured a lethal outcome through meticulous planning. Miss Marple nodded sadly at this confirmation before going on to the evidence that revealed the killer's identity. The clues that led Mr. Laura astray were numerous and telling. The propulolis found on both the lure note and the bedroom door lock were made by hands that were familiar with bee goods. The yellow pollen on the door staple offered more evidence of recent interaction with active hives. Inspector Slack studied his notes as she resumed her list of incriminating material. The square-trimmed lantern wick matched Mr. Laura's demonstrated technique, as opposed to Mr. Pike's slanted cuts and Mrs. Petherick's clean bevels. The green binder string used to suspend the nest was identical to what we saw in his workshop, but it was the discovery of the beekeeper's veil that had offered the most incriminating evidence of all. We discovered the murderer's protective clothing in the attic, which had allowed him to work safely around the agitated wasps.